everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on how to unlock the full value of telemetry data, sponsored by Mesmo. I'm Katie D, online and social media editor at SD Times, and to kick things off, I just wanted to mention a few quick housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and available for on-demand viewing around 24 hours after the session on sdtimes.com. Mesmo will also be accepting audience questions, so feel free to send any of those through the chat. Today, we will learn about how to overcome challenges and streamline your telemetry data strategy, balance greater insight with the cost of managing higher data volumes, gain wider adoption across several different use cases, and more. Now, to dive deeper into this topic, let's turn it over to today's speakers. Ashka Vakil, Senior Director of Product Management at Mesmo, and Matt Aslett, VP and Research Director of Digital Technology at Ventana Research. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Katie, for the introductions. Happy Tuesday, you all. Hope you're having a great day. Thank you for joining us. In terms of agenda, we'll start by talking a little bit about Ventana Research and Mesmo, what we do, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation, which is walk you through the various considerations that you need to consider to unlock the full value of telemetry data. We will end with the recommendations from both Ventana and Mesmo with a short demo on my side of our product that can actually help you think about observability as you keep those considerations in mind. With that, let's kick it off. And I will have Matt talk about Ventana Research.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks for having us on this webinar. So yeah, just a little bit about Ventana before we get into the key topic of the webinar itself here. So we're a market advisory and research services firm, as you can see here. And in particular, we pride ourselves on our insightful, independent research and services that we deliver through, tailored and trusted client experience. If you see on the next slide, we've got a specific focus areas that we have between the analyst team here. I'm part of the technology specific aspect, as we refer to it, which is analytics and data and digital technology and digital business. And then we've got another side of the business, which is focused more on some of the applications that rely on some of those underlying technologies. So in areas like Office of Finance, marketing, customer experience, human capital management, for example. But my primary area of focus is data, including data platforms, data management, data governance, data operations, streaming data and events, and also the digital technology area. So with that, I'll hand you back. We'll hear a little bit more about Mesmo.
Thank you, Matt. Let's talk about Mesmo. Mesmo, actually, some of you may know us more as LogDNA. That was our name about a year back. We actually were a YC or are a YC company that started in 2014. And our focus, as the name LogDNA would tell you, was on log management and analysis. Over the years, we found great success. We currently process 5 petabytes of data. We have over 100,000 monthly active users. We are the sole logging provider for IBM Cloud, what that means is IBM white labels Mesmo's log analysis solution to provide logging for all of their cloud customers. We have over 3,400 customers across SMB, mid-market, and even large enterprise. We are recognized as a digital leader in this space. Now, over time, we've realized that there are these big, hairy problems with data, which is there's too much data. Data is not in the right format, and the data is not in the right place. These problems are big, hairy problems that are not solved by one single vendor currently, and we think that that's where Mesmo can help. Our expertise in log analysis, log management helped us come up with new product called Telemetry Pipeline that helps us tackle these 3 big hairy problems of not data being in the right format, data not being in the right place, and too much data. We actually rebranded from LogDNA to Mesmo to help all of you understand that it's a lot more than log analysis, though log is a big part of this, but it's really around telemetry data. And with that, I want to hand over to Matt to walk you through how you can get most value from your telemetry data. He will actually talk about what is telemetry data, because there is a lot of confusion in the industry today of what really is telemetry data. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Matt, to talk a little bit about telemetry data and some of the considerations in getting value out from telemetry data.
Thanks, Ashka. And yeah, as you say, let's start off by just being clear about what we mean when we talk about telemetry data. So we're really talking there about data related to logs, traces, and metrics. It's generated by computing infrastructure. So machine generated data coming from things like servers, networking equipment, IoT devices, and of course, applications. And what we see is that observability of telemetry data is really key to detecting issues and acting quickly to remedy failures and performance problems, and enabling organizations to ensure that their systems and applications are operating efficiently. So observability of telemetry data is very much important, obviously, to the IT department. And I think what we've seen is traditionally, it's really been the domain of the IT department. But as organizations are engaging with customers, suppliers, and partners increasingly through digital channels, telemetry data is increasingly also important for business decision makers. Modern organizations are almost completely dependent on their applications and their infrastructure, whether that's on premises or in the cloud. And so we need to see that business decision makers also can generate value from telemetry data by understanding the organization's ability to respond to, changing customer demand, changing business scenarios. So, think, for example, about, a logistics company and the applications and infrastructure that organization has that provides information about things like stock levels, deliveries, customers. That's just as mission critical as things like its trucks and loading equipment and drivers. And we see this replicated in all kinds of organizations in all different industries. So we go to the next slide. You can see that we assert that based on the increasing importance of of telemetry data, more than 1/2 of organizations will increase their investment in observability technology to accelerate the value being generated from that data, as I said, particularly sort of logs, traces, and metrics, and that's the starting point. But if we move on to the next slide, one of the issues we see is that unlocking the full value of telemetry data and translating it into business decisions and business value is easier said than done. As Ashka said, data volume and data complexity and fragmentation they're all growing. And with that comes challenges that organizations must address if they're going to unlock the full value of their data. And as we identified here sort of 5 key considerations that we think organizations need to be taking into account as they think about getting the most value from their telemetry data. And we'll go into to discuss each one in turn, but just to set the scene here, those 5 are balancing the cost and the value of more data, higher data volumes, enabling wider adoption across multiple use cases across an organization, understanding the business context of IT issues, ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements, and then lastly, that issue of data distribution and data being fragmented across multiple environments. So let's start with the first of those, which is obviously balancing the cost and value of high data volumes. Now, Ashka talked about obviously the increasing volumes of data, the increasing number of data sources. We see that the complexity of modern IT infrastructure means telemetry data needs to be ingested and analyzed from an enormous range of computing equipment, sensors, and applications. And the volume of telemetry data is rapidly increasing. And that increase is really hard to manage. We see that from our analytics and data benchmark research, actually 3/4 of organizations are confident in their ability to analyze the variety of data and data sources that's available to them. but only 59% are confident in their organization's ability to analyze the volume of data that they have across their organization. Additionally, of course, managing and monitoring data costs money in the form of both, time and technology investments, and budgets quite often are not keeping up, especially, in the current market conditions. So what we see is that observability pipelines have a potential role to play in helping to centralize and transform data to reduce costs and delays. Still, the upfront cost is a challenge, with 59% of organizations citing the cost of technology as a barrier to improving analytics. So organizations are really forced to balance the need for more data with the cost and complexity of managing all that data. So Ashka, in your experience, how do you advise organizations to think about this balance between, the potential for greater insight, which is obviously there from more data, but obviously the cost that comes with monitoring and managing higher data volumes?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. I mean, this is a classic Costco problem that has been a topic of discussion more often than not, right? Especially with the advent of microservices and explosion of applications due to cloud computing, mobile devices. Data is just growing rapidly. It's growing at this rate, which is just hard to fathom. And I feel like with some of the advances that have happened in a couple of months, with ChatGPT being able to help create code and solution, like it's just going to be much, the pace of development and digitization is just going to dramatically increase, is how I feel. It's just going, we'll have to see how the next couple of months and year folds out, but I have a strong indication that the revolution with ChatGPT is going to change the way, and the data is going to grow at even a higher rate than it is today. However, like you say, the resources to manage, monitor, and derive the value from this data is not actually growing at the same rate. And that is a big challenge for a lot of organizations today. To drive this point home, let's just look at the stats that are around data explosion and its impacts. So just to give you an example, I've spoken to many medium-sized companies. I've myself worked at large organizations, and just looking at medium-sized companies, these are companies that are doing about 25 to 50 million ARR with a team of about 200, 300 engineering. They have about 400 to 600 microservices, and it's growing. Now imagine the scale of these companies. If they were to hit million users, the data that is going to grow is just going to be unmanageable. But this data is not, all of it is not valuable, right? Like you need this data when, from an engineering standpoint, when you need to debug. Otherwise, it's just the money that you will have to spend to store this data, more as an insurance, if you will. In fact, for IDC, data is growing at the rate of 23% year over year. Imagine the incremental cost to store all this additional data that is being generated, right? And unfortunately, the IT budget is not increasing at the same rate. In fact, the IT budgets are lagging by a factor of 4. So at some point, all the organizations, as they grow and scale, they realize that this physics of storing this increasing volume of data doesn't make sense, right? Everyone hits that point. There's just isn't enough value. And it's the cost for this data that may never get used. The organizations have to make a decision on how much premium they want to pay for having the insurance to have the data. In fact, recently we had a VP of platform engineering at one large company mention that if they were to send all their data to New Relic, which is what they're using, it would cost them 60% of their total cloud budget. Imagine that. That's insane, right? Like 60% of your total cloud budget spent on just one tool. And he was like, yes, and we are not doing that. So now what happens is once the organization hits this point, they're faced with this dilemma. They have two options really, which is like, blow through the budget, suck it up, pay for the insurance, store all this data because you may need it, right? You may need it at some point. You have to make decisions on how long you store, what you pay, how it is, or take risks, store, let's just say errors that can help with debug when needed, maybe reduce the time window, and then think of like adding logs later on if they were not enough. Unfortunately, the trade-off is hard and there's no winning here. It's just losing because it's like choosing the worst of the two. So organizations are unfortunately forced to balance the need for more data and the cost and the complexity of doing that. I would love to know what your organization does. If you can respond to the poll, that would be great. It should pop up in your screen now. Okay, I'm just monitoring the poll. We had a couple of answers come in. So looks like a lot of you are filtering and storing relevant events only in the observability data. I think that's very common. That's really what I've seen. I've seen some of you saying that you store all the events in the observability tool, and then some of you send relevant events to observability tool. I think all of this are common. I think what you all are sharing is the most common that I've seen. Right, what I want to share is there is a better way of doing it, and the observability telemetry pipelines are a way to approach this dilemma. So what you can do is you can use pipelines to filter, transform, and route your data to reduce cost and lower complexity. Now, again, you need to know what data to route, but then over time, these pipelines can become smart where, as the error rate is spiking up, they can start collecting data and routing those data to the right tools where you want to store them. So you can do a lot of interesting things if there is a pipeline that is sitting in front of all of your tools that can help you make those real-time decisions, if you will, versus upfront decisions of what to filter down, what to drop, and what to store, versus this could be more of dynamic decisions that could be made in using pipelines. So Matt, that's how I think of a solution to this problem, where upfront decision doesn't need to be made, but it could be more dynamic.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we've seen as organizations trying to make more dynamic use of this data. They know it's useful across the organization, but they need to be more dynamic in how they make use of that.
Yeah, that's great. Let's move on to the next consideration.
And yeah, talking of which, enabling wider adoption across multiple use cases. So clearly, let's take it as read. There is value in telemetry data. We know that, but I think what we see in that last talking point there is that the value of that data is not necessarily fully realized unless we see wider adoption across multiple use cases across an organization, beyond the IT organization, or even multiple use cases even within that organization. Traditionally, observability platforms, while they provide value, can lead to silos of IT infrastructure data that are only really accessible by technology engineers. They will be getting value from that data, but it's somewhat limited. Additionally, that data is often unstructured and in formats that can't necessarily easily be used by downstream observability offerings. So business decision makers and developers and DevOps practitioners and all manner of people within an organization also need access to that data, potentially, if they're to understand the business risks that are associated with IT incidents and deliver value across the entire organization in multiple departments. So Ashka, I mean, what are the best practices you've seen from organizations in terms of unlocking that additional value beyond the IT organization by enabling access to telemetry data for workers in other roles beyond technology engineering?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, Matt. Like you said, observability is traditionally seen as an engineering tool, right? Like you will have typically CTO, VP, or director as a buyer of the tool. However, I have seen more and more realization in other buyers that telemetry data can help non-engineering team do, like data teams, business, and security teams. Let me tell a story that will sound familiar and drive home this realization about telemetry data being useful for not just engineering use cases, but also for other organizations, other teams in the organization. So we all know engineers love telemetry data. I mean, in my past life as an engineer, I have used it to debug my software, monitor what's happening, and letting me know when then there is a problem. So let's pretend that I've been tasked with building a web application for a group of sales folks. Sounds familiar, right? Like the tasks keep coming up. I'm asked, like, create this web app that can track things like how many deals are people closing, how many sales are we making, what is the churn. So I go and build this amazing web application. I log data to help me debug, troubleshoot, monitor the application because I'm a good engineer. I like data. I want to make sure that if there is a need, I can easily find where the problem is. I decide to be verbose with my logging and I log all this data. I ship the app and it's a big success. Now, as an engineer, my goal is to make sure that the web app continues to work, it performs well, it doesn't fail. I set up alerts that notify me if the threshold is used. I use logs to debug and resolve the issue. Life is good, right? Now think of business. The business that I'm building the app for is super happy, but they come back asking, like, can I get some basic reporting capabilities? This always happens, right? It's always after the fact. Like once the product tool is launched, the ask comes back, like business wants to know how the app is doing, what is the uptake. Let's say they want to know who is the top salesperson or who is the biggest deal that has been closed this month. This was not the initial requirement. Engineering doesn't have the bandwidth to do that. It's a lot of work. And business typically will go to the analysts. And what would analysts do? They decide to pull in a data engineer to build an extract, transform, and load process, ETL process that takes all this data, which is existing in a database, puts it in a data warehouse, creates a report that sales leader uses. So now business is leveraging data to make decisions, but it's building traditional ETL pipelines to access this data, which we know can take a lot of time and resources and what have you. Imagine a world where, and which is what we have found a lot of customers, the answers to this business questions is already sitting in the telemetry data and they are already producing. Like engineers need that data to help debug, as we just talked about, but businesses can actually take advantage of that data that is sitting in the logs and they don't have to build this ETL that they traditionally do. So, like this realization that that data exists and it could be leveraged by businesses and engineering is one such. There's another scenario which we didn't talk about, but security teams can also leverage this data, right? And I'll tell you a little story in the nugget. I myself experienced this at my previous role before Mesmo, where I was building a product. I launched a new product. I wanted to get product metrics like DAU, MAU, time on site for the product that I managed. We, of course, did not start off building the product as like I needing this data right away, but I really wanted to know this data to know whether the product is successful or not. So we did not have any instrumentation or hooks to collect such data. I had this brilliant engineer in the team who was like, hey, Ashka, we have logs that we store in CloudWatch, and I can potentially parse these logs to generate the metrics that you need because we log every user that is opening our application in this log, and I can parse that log and give you the DAU, I can give you the MAU, I can give you the time on site. And I was like, that's amazing. So what did he do? He just wrote a script, he parsed these logs, he stored those metrics in the Redshift, and now I was able to visualize it in Tableau. So what we had is this logs that were used for monitoring were now helping me on the product team to not just look at the product health metrics, but even product success metrics. And this was used by the business teams like our VP of product or GM, everyone, to understand how the product was doing. And, if we needed this product to get more resources, be it engineering resources, or we need to spend more to grow this product. And it was all possible through logs, right? So this realization is growing. People are running into the scenarios. They're finding ways that this telemetry data can be useful. But then what happens is organizations, after realizing this value, they will not be able to centralize it, right? Like, it's each team that is realizing it now, trying to get access to this log sources or datas, and then we have bunch of tools falling into different categories and different buyers: observability tools, security tools, data lakes, analytics tool. All of them have their own ingestion paths. They support different data formats, and data needs to land into those. So what you start seeing is this mishmash of all this data flows all around the organization, creating like a big hairy ball of data movements and data flows that is not really centralized. That has its own challenges, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit. But Matt, like, I'm seeing more and more organizations realizing the value that telemetry data is useful, not just for engineering tool, but also for business. But then what they do is they have this kind of architecture that is not scalable. So I would love to know from you all, like, what your organization does today. Is this something that looks similar to what you do in your organization? If you can help answer that by answering a quick poll, that would be great. Okay, we got a couple of yeses here. That's great. And again, pipelines can actually help break the silos, right? Because pipelines can enable wider adoption across multiple organizations by centralizing all the sources that you're ingesting data from, allowing you to transform that and then send it to the various different tools. So it's much better architecture than what you saw in the slide. It's like one single line that is now going to these different tools. So pipelines can definitely help break these silos. It reduces the manpower, democratizes data for full use within the organization. There's a third consideration that we should probably talk about, because that is also something that is pretty common.
Yeah, I think, as you just described there, I mean, clearly breaking down the silos by enabling access to data and enabling pipelines that bring data together is really important. Clearly, another aspect, though, is making sure that there is understanding within the organization of the business implications of IT infrastructure failure and performance issues. That is actually, sounds pretty straightforward, but it can be quite problematic for business teams. Observability platforms handle the process of passing data from computing equipment, sensors, and applications, across on-premises and cloud environments, as we said earlier. But the resulting data often lacks business context. The IT organization, the engineers can understand what that data it relates to in terms of the infrastructure, but there's a gap then in terms of understanding what the implications might be from a business perspective. Specialist skills we see are often required to actually interpret and act upon that information. So observability data, not only needs to be made available to business users, but also needs to be enriched and augmented with business event data to help organizations understand what the impact of infrastructure issues might be on their ability to do important things like serve customers and partners and suppliers. And this is a really tricky issue, as I've said, which to which organizations are evolving their response to. Ashka, again, what do you see in terms of the best practices that to really unlock that additional value? And as I said, we know the value's there, we know the technology exists to help bring that together, but it's about enabling that business context via enrichment of the telemetry data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, engineering teams like operate with certain assumptions, right? And it's all about making sure the SLIs and SLOs are met. Focuses on actually reducing MTTR. If you look at the core metrics of engineering team, what a good engineering team looks like, these are all the metrics that are being tracked by engineering leaders. Though, like you said, like I totally agree that teams can operate much better if they are able to understand the business implication. In addition, right? Like, for example, imagine the website slowness, right? Like, let's just say there is an e-commerce website, engineering is monitoring, has all the monitoring things put in place correctly, and it may still meet the KPI of the response time because the degradation is probably maybe like really minimal, half a second. It's not meeting the alert thresholds, right? Like it's still acceptable. But imagine that it is actually impacting the checkout process and cart is getting abandoned more frequently. If there was the business insight or context associated now with this monitoring aspect, imagine engineering team will know, for example, the dollar amount that is getting impacted because of this sub-second or even less of slowness of the website, that they mark this as a high urgency and they start to look at what is actually causing that latency, right? Like, and then on the flip side, let's say that 404 errors are happening very frequently and the threshold is met and gets an alert generated, but it may be happening at 1 a.m. All the customers that you have are in North America. It's really like late night. There aren't that many people on your website browsing or doing checkouts, and the impact, while there are a lot of 404s, the slowness, latency, what have you, that's causing all those 404s is not really impacting the business per se in terms of cart abandonment or loss of revenue. And engineers may have a little more time to respond. They don't have to get on the call like at 1 a.m. in the morning and try and scramble in this case because the impact is really low. But unfortunately, right, like that's not what a lot of observability platforms do that. Like you said, observability platforms handle the process of parsing the data from computing equipment, sensors, applications across multiple on-premises and cloud environments, but the resulting data actually lacks that business context. So for engineering team, they're operating, in my opinion, without a critical data that is around the impact on the business, and they are forced to respond the same way, even if it may not be critical, or same way if it's like the most critical thing that they should be looking at. So there is growing realization, but the observability tools today do not have that ability to bring in business context. Unfortunately, it's two different silos. To some extent, there are two different kinds of tools that deal with business data, business context, and then engineering, monitoring data and monitoring context, if you will. Maybe a quick poll again, like, does this resonate with you all? Like, would you think like adding business context, or even if you're already doing that today, we would love to know. Okay, looks like it's split. Looks like some of you already are considering business context. Definitely would love to know more thoughts. We don't have time and opportunity to do that here on this call, but would love to know how you're doing that today with your current set of tools. But I do think that pipelines can actually solve this problem, and maybe you created a in-house pipeline to get this data, or there's some other mechanisms, but actually teams can enrich and augment telemetry data with business event to fully understand the impact of infrastructure issue and respond accordingly, right? In my previous example, what if they are also getting that dollar value associated with an outage, or the dollar value increase as the issue spiking latency is increasing, you're seeing the increase in the dollar value that can help you respond. So let's move on to the next consideration. Matt, can you talk a little bit about the compliance, ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, obviously there's multiple aspects of sort of business implications of telemetry data, and you talked about some of them, but one of them potentially is obviously regulatory requirements, and compliance with those obviously have the potential to be very, very important and mission critical, depending on the organization you're in and the type of industry you're in. And what we see is that, the complexity of, modern data architecture leaves mission critical applications exposed potentially to compliance risks. Organizations absolutely need to be aware of the regulatory and compliance requirements and factor those requirements into the policies that govern how they deal with data. And that means data from any source, really. We see the most significant data governance challenge cited by almost 3/4 of organizations in our benchmark research is disparate data sources and systems. Now, of course, not all data governance initiatives will be driven by regulatory compliance itself. However, the risk of falling afoul of privacy and human rights laws ensures that regulatory compliance influences data processing requirements, whatever industry you're in, whatever region of the world you're in. Even if the data is machine generated and isn't necessarily related to specific customers, for example, transactional data from applications, there may still be privacy issues, especially if you're combining that data with data from other sources, which does expose customer related information. So this is a real potentially thorny issue, and I think it's one that is potentially overlooked by organizations when they think specifically about their telemetry data. So Ashka, in your experience, I mean, do you agree? Do you think organizations are fully aware of the compliance and privacy risks that are potentially associated with telemetry data compared to obviously the way they look after their business data?
Yeah, no, there is definitely some gaps there. And I've seen customers not applying the same data governance and telemetry data as they typically would on a business or customer data, right? Like, as you were mentioning, it's not because that customers don't want to, but it's actually super hard to apply data governance and telemetry data. Given the volume, the sources that generate telemetry data, along with large surface area, some of which you called Matt out, and we've talked about previously in this conversation, it's just hard to put a model in place to put governance around it, right? Like, it's super hard. Imagine like a junior engineer somewhere ends up logging PII as it pertains to the personal information, credit card, name, what have you, and it ends up in your observability tool, now exposing you to the risk of not meeting the regulatory compliance. It actually happens more often than not, unfortunately, just because it's so hard. Like, someone is writing a piece of code, how much of that can happen? I mean, lot of companies have processes in place to have code reviews and whatnot, but sometimes those things get lost, not caught, and your organization can land into trouble, right? With some of these things getting into your logs and you not having a policy or governance around it. Let me actually share some stats here that will help everyone understand the risks, because someone's small mistake somewhere of exposing a PII in a microservice can cost company millions of dollars, if not more. So, small mistake can cause hefty fine, bring the organization down. I'm sure you've been all giving this a thought. You've been in some chair at some point in time, like thinking about how to put data governance on the telemetry data. It's a little bit easier to do that on the business data, the customer data. There's a lot more awareness. There's a lot more scrutiny, security, but telemetry data, something can slip. It's just a log line, right? That is there, and then it shows up somewhere, someplace. I would love as you would probably know, I love polls. It's a way for me to interact with you all, learn a little bit more about you all. So I would love to get your thoughts on this question around governance. If you can answer the poll, please. Okay, this is interesting. Like, most of you are saying that you don't handle data governance with telemetry data, and man, this kind of shares or makes it clear, right, the point that we are making. Just because it's hard, there's awareness, but it's super hard to put those things in place. And I think the pipelines are a great way. We've seen our customers actually getting excited about pipelines for that, because what you can do is you can, as you're aggregating all this data, all these logs, metrics, traces, all these events that are coming in, you can actually enforce masking of that sensitive information before it lands into your analysis tools where it gets exposed to a lot more people. So you can have that governance easily done, which is not possible today through these pipelines that can help you encrypt, mask all the sensitive information and make sure that it doesn't land into your tools, and save your organization the pain that may come from having PII exposed. All right, we are at our last consideration. Matt, take us through that. Oh, I think, Matt, you're on mute.
Sorry, that was bound to happen at some point. Yeah, so one of the things we see about organizations that are challenged in relation to data governance, and this happens with all data, is that data is increasingly distributed and fragmented. You know, we see that the generation, processing, and storage of data is now happening across multiple data centers, both private and public, as well as across multiple application, service providers. And we see from our research that more than 1/2 of organizations report using 11 or more data sources, and more than 2/5 are using more than one cloud provider. So fragmentation is a fundamental challenge in managing data, across the board, but also in integrating and routing data across this increasingly distributed architecture. For larger organizations, especially, that are operating across multiple regions with multiple departments in multiple locations, fragmented, unstructured telemetry data spread across a large number of sources can slow down response times and delays reactions to changing market conditions. So Ashika, it sounds like you've seen this as a challenge in the companies you work with. But what's your recommendation for organizations that are struggling, with this aspect of integrating and managing data across a distributed architecture?
Yeah, you're right, man. This is a very common challenge at almost every customer prospect that we have talked to, right? Like, there's never a single source. More than likely, there are multiple cloud providers, or at least if there's a single cloud provider, you will find that there are multiple regions where they are hosting their product teams that have different standards and ways of logging. Add to that the mergers and the acquisitions, and another set of challenges comes in with different tools in play, to languages and use, or different cloud providers, and it's just a mess, right? We did a Harris poll at Mesmo last year and learned that the respondents, which were about 100 plus, had 3+, all of them had 3+ sources of data and at least 2 observability tools. Can you imagine the data with distribution and fragmentation at companies these days? It's just incredible and insane. And I'll share some stats to make it real for you all, that data fragmentation is actually real. It's here to stay. It's actually going to get worse. We were just talking with an engineering manager at Pinterest, and he told us that they have 5 different languages, 10 different frameworks. They are spending now time and resources on adding standardization tags to better explore and consume data in a structured way. Imagine the effort and coordination needed to do this. We have a big customer at Mesmo who has gone through the pains. They have like 100 different teams. There's the central team that goes through the pains of making sure that everyone follows the data standardization that they have put together and tags are put in. But again, they run into this challenge because there will be some rogue agent, rogue team somewhere that doesn't like to comply or forgets to comply. Right. So there is this fragmentation that is really real. Like just looking at these numbers, if you can look at the slide, there are 56% organizations with 11 or more data sources. To me, when I looked at the stat that there are organizations with 16 or more observability tools, and there are 11% of them, that's insane, right? And then we probably know there are organizations up little less than 50% who have more than one cloud provider. In fact, average number of cloud providers in a given company these days is at least 2. So data fragmentation is real. I promise this is my second last poll. If you can share your organization's fragmentation by answering this quick question, that would help us get a sense of where your organization is. Okay, we see most of you picked like 6 to 10. There was someone who said 1. Wow, kudos to you and your organization for keeping it lean, right? Like one observability tool, way to go, amazing. Rooting for you for sure. But rest of you, yeah, you're not the only one. Don't worry, as you saw the stats, a lot of organizations, that's a sweet spot number that we're looking at. And, pipelines can actually help again, because you can centralize this data from multiple sources across cloud providers, use the processors to transform this data into the structure that you want. You can add tags, you can manage. So the Pinterest engineering manager example that I was giving to you, they're trying to manually do that. They're using some open source technologies to do that. But with pipeline, you can actually get a lot of that done very easily. Simply bring in a new source or bring in a new observability tool, and you can hook it up, transform with that data very easily versus having to now create one yet endpoint, right? So definitely pipelines can be an answer to this fragmentation and help you manage cost, because now you are centralizing all of that under one place. So we just talked about the 5 recommendations and what we've seen with organizations and how pipelines can help. I'll hand over to Matt to talk about what Ventana recommends, how they have seen, what are they recommending to their customers. And then I'll talk a little bit about Mesmo's pipeline approach, show you in action a demo that actually helps you get those 5 considerations and how pipelines can help across those in a nutshell.
Yeah, so thanks, Ashka. So obviously there's multiple, I mean, you can build out the slide. Obviously there's multiple aspects we've talked about here, and we only picked 5 considerations. Clearly there's more nuances we could have gone into. But when we look at an effective observability strategy, we really see that there are 3 key components of that. Those are access and control, actionable insights, and faster time to value. So in terms of access and control, we see that organizations need to focus on managing and providing wider real-time access to high volumes of data from a variety of sources, as we discussed, and reduce reliance on sort of centralized observability platforms and the high level of costs that can come from putting all that data in one single environment. Obviously, when we talk about actionable insights, the ability to, as we talked about, analyze and trim and augment data in motion, adding context and correlations can help get more business insight and business value from that data. And in terms of, obviously faster time to value, accelerating the value that's generated, optimized data that's available across an organization via pre-built recipes and best practices, and obviously, a user-friendly user interface is really important in terms of driving faster time to value and enabling, not just the IT engineers, as we've talked about, to generate value from that data, but also the business, and to understand the business context of telemetry data as well. And yeah, just a couple of links here if you want to follow up any more about our research around this area. You can see the links there. So please do. We're glad to hear from companies.
Thank you, Matt. Let's talk a little bit about Mesmo's approach. By now you know it's telemetry pipeline that can help you manage costs by getting value from your data. It's no longer a compromise that you have to make. You can enable multiple use cases and wider adoption, tie business context with IT issues to help prioritize and respond in time, achieve data governance, and last but not least, aggregate sources across cloud providers to manage fragmentation. So I will show a build-up of this slide that actually helps with all those 5 considerations that we talked about, and we did go into details of how pipeline can help, but this is all bringing it together. So imagine a scenario where you are an engineering team, you're using OpenTelemetry, you're using Kubernetes, and you have logs coming from Prometheus syslog, and you want to send it to Grafana for visualization, Datadog, Splunk, pipeline. You can all aggregate all of this data and then route it, structure it, transform it, put in governance in place by masking the data, and send the data in the right format, right quantity, reducing the cost to the right tools where it needs to be. Again, solving the problem of too much data in not the right format, and data in not the right place. Now, add on to that there is a need from security team to actually use the logs, as we've talked about, but the tools that they want to send to are QRadar, also the Splunk as a SIM, not the observability, and then maybe as S3 more for compliance for long-term storage. Pipeline can help that, support it. It's very easy built up. You already had data ingested from syslog and Mesmo, and now all you have to do is transform that data, put in the format that you need to support for Splunk or Amazon and QRadar, and you get there, right? And then another use case I want to show is business teams. They want to get some analytics, right? And it can, again, be very easily done. So, you could have multiple pipelines, single pipeline, however your business sees it, however your organization sees. There's a lot of flexibility for you to enable this wider use cases across the organization and not just limit the telemetry data in IT teams, in silo, but democratizing that data, really unlocking that data for your users, for your organization. Let me show a quick demo to kind of show the pipeline in action. Some of the things that Matt was talking about in terms of ease of use, they will all be apparent here. So I will put it in, I'll play it and put it in full screen mode, so it's much better for you all to see. So the first thing we are going to show is building a very basic pipeline, right? There is a data from the Apache logs that we are just sending to webhooks. I'll pause here for a second so you can see what is going on. What you see here, and it didn't pause, sorry. Demos are always a fail, even though this is a video. But what I want to show here, you can see is this is just a basic connection. It's all your data that is being generated by Apache, all your logs that are being sent to a webhook. But the view that you're seeing is it can now allow you to see what is that data that is coming in, right? Like you want to get a snapshot of the actual data that is flowing so you can have the baseline when you make changes. So our tool supports for you to create this data. Now let's just say that, this is a very basic pipeline, but now you want to leverage new sources. Let's just say a security team wants to evaluate a SIM or a SOAR or some other offering. What you can do with pipeline is easily add that destination and start routing that data. So as you can see here, once the snapshot has been taken, you will see how easy it is to enable that scenario that I'm talking about, where you just want to send all these logs from Apache source into a SIM that just says Splunk in this case. Imagine having to do a POC for Splunk or any other SOAR. And again, we have all of this. There is this processor called route processor that helps you route that data. And we have a pre-built Splunk destination that you can very easily connect to and route this data very, very easily. So that's what you're going to see in this demo in just a second here. Again, very easy to drag and drop, bring in new sources. We are adding not just Apache logs, but now we are bringing in the demo logs as well and deciding to route those aggregated logs into Splunk. Again, these are all the destinations that we support out of box, and we're continuing to grow this ecosystem of the sources destinations that we support, so you don't have to do all the hard work. It's really pre-built for you all to take advantage of. And it might be a little bit hard to see some of these things, so I apologize for that. It's always hard to have the video show up properly in this kind of webinars and presentations. But this is really how quick and easy it is to get a portion of that data sent to Splunk. Now, let's say the security team also wants to send all of this data to long-term storage like S3 because it is really cost effective. You need all the data from a compliance standpoint. Again, you can very easily get that set up, right? And I will actually go towards the end and fast forward and pause here where I want to show you a fully built out view where it's not just data that is getting routed, but but you can see, okay, this has been a challenge for me to get that screen. Okay, here's a fully built out view, right? Like, which is where we have all this encrypt, where you can encrypt the credit card number, encrypt the user, and make sure that none of that PII information is landing into Splunk. So this is just one example. There is a lot more you can do, but I wanted to show how quickly, how easy and iterative it is to build onto the pipeline and do some great things with it. So with that, I just want to summarize that pipelines can enable data access and reduce spend. They can increase data value to power your workflows. And then pipeline can allow access to this telemetry data, which is not just IT, but also provide business events to support the compliance. So in closing, Mesmo provides an observability pipeline to collect, transform, and route telemetry data to control costs and drive actionability. With this telemetry pipeline, you can connect to any data source, transform the data to your need, and take only the data that you require to your destinations. Now, everyone has the data that they need in the right format, and you're not sending or storing too much of data that you do not need. I will end with the last poll of the day. Let us know your thoughts about the pipeline. And thank you so much for joining us today. You can learn more about Mesmo by heading to mesmo.com. You can also scan a QR code, which is right on your screen to schedule a demo. We have probably a minute or two for any questions that you may have that Matt or myself can answer. Thank you again.
Thank you so much again for your presentation. And it looks like we do have a few questions. So the first one came through the chat a little earlier in your talk, and they were wondering what the technology stack of tech leaders looks like for telemetry streaming. in terms of ingestion, enrichment, and streaming. And audience members can feel free to answer this for themselves in the chat if they would like to throw their 2 cents in as well.
Matt, do you want to take the first stab at that? I'm happy to as well.
Yeah, if you want to start, I'll add to the conversation.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think Raghu, you asked this question. I'm just looking at the chat. What the technology stack looks like for their telemetry streaming. What we have seen is lot of organizations who have the bandwidth to do this, they will use some open source technologies to do that. We've seen NiFi, which is like a very common one. We've seen people using Kafka to stream their telemetry data. Again, there are a lot of these challenges, as you may have seen with any open source technologies out there, that it requires teams to scale, manage, do a lot of those things, and it's not always easy to do it. So that's really what I've seen. I've not seen really like solutions out there yet. It's mostly cobbled together through this open source technologies that they use for streaming their telemetry data.
Yeah, and I'd say, as you say, that there's so many choices out there, which is good. Choice is a good thing, but I think we've seen some of perhaps the leaders have made strategic choices around those. But in many cases, you'll have organizations which will have multiple different technologies for streaming and enrichment across multiple departments. And some of what we were talking about is the challenge of not just bringing that fragmented data together, but also some of the tools and technologies together to address that.
All right, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. Thank you guys so much again for your presentation. And thank you all again to our audience for joining us. As a reminder, the webinar will be available for on-demand viewing in around 24 hours. And with that, I think that we're all wrapped up. Thank you guys again.
Thank you so much.
Right.